Transactions are the lifeblood of the payments industry. Understanding how transactions work is critically important if you work at an inbound customer call center, a payments operations team at a bank or merchant services company, or supporting fraud and risk strategies at a merchant services company, or a card issuer. The good news is that we are all customers. So let's put on that hat for a second as we explore, where does a transaction go? We are in a store. At the checkout, we have the items we want to purchase. Once the items are scanned at the point of sale device, I pull up my payment card to pay for them. What happens next? Yeah, I tap my card on the terminal and the terminal beeps. Then in less than 15 seconds, the screen on the terminal says, approved, and we walk out of the store with our stuff. But what happens in those seconds? Let's do a dissection on the transaction and find out. Like any dissection, we must first identify the major parts before we can discuss how they contribute to the process. So, let's identify the participants that make the transaction magic happen. 1. Customer or cardholder. We will find several of the participants carry two names. In this case, the merchant sees us as the customer. The bank or credit union who provides us with the payment card calls us a cardholder. The same person. Oh my. We just used terms we haven't defined yet. Let's get those terms defined. 2. Merchant. A merchant can be a store or an individual. A merchant is simply the entity providing the merchandise, service, subscription, or other thing of value to its customer. 3. Acquirer or merchant services company. Once again, there are two names as this company links two parts of the payments chain. To the payments network, they are the acquirer, the entity that brings the transaction into the payments network. To the merchant, this company provides the equipment, links, and processes so the merchant can accept payment cards, a merchant services company. 4. Payments network. This company provides the physical network connecting the acquirers to the companies providing the payment cards. The payment network also provides services like detailed transaction reporting, reconciliation reports, currency conversion, security and risk services, and financial settlement services. 5. The issuer. This is the bank, credit union, fintech, merchant, or other company that provides the account and the payment card linked to it. This account may be a line of credit, a prepaid account, or a deposit or debit account. The issuer also vets each transaction to ensure it is legitimate and not fraud, and that the cardholder account has sufficient funds for that transaction. The transaction will be approved or declined based on these parameters. Now that we've defined the major participants in a payment card transaction, let's track the transaction path. I will highlight details that are important to you working in payment card support roles. We will quickly find out there are two elements to a transaction, data and money. Each has its own path and cadence. Watch how they interact with each other through the transaction flow. When we're at the store checkout, the transaction total is tallied. For our example, this is done by a point of sale or POS scanner. Except for specialized commercial card transactions, the detailed list of what was purchased stays with the merchant. The customer will likely have a receipt document with the same information. None of the other participants in the transaction flow see this level of detail. This is important to know if your role is authorization strategy, call center rep, or cardholder disputes agent. Only the merchant and the cardholder know what was purchased. And in the case of a dispute, they may have different opinions on that topic. The terminal asks for my payment card. Though the payment network is not on anybody's mind at this point in the transaction, it is a most important detail. Each payment card is linked to one or more payment networks. MasterCard, Visa, American Express, Discover, JCB, and China UnionPay are some of the larger international payment networks. There are also many national and regional networks, especially for debit cards. For a payment to work, both the merchant terminal and the cardholder's card must have at least one network in common. If there are more than one network in common, the merchant or acquirer can use whichever network is best for them, like the least expensive one. The next most important detail is called POS Entry Mode, or how is the card information entered into the terminal? Here are some of the methods relevant to this in-person or face-to-face transaction. Key entered. The merchant manually enters the card number, the PAN, and the other card details into the terminal. In face-to-face transactions, this POS entry mode is used far more for fraud than for legitimate transactions. As a card holder or as a payments industry support person, you don't want to see this happen. Key entered is okay for non-face-to-face, like phone orders, but not for face-to-face transactions. Swiped. The swiping motion transmits the card data from the magnetic stripe on the back of the card to the terminal. This method has been used for decades. However, magnetic stripe is no longer considered a secure POS entry mode. Major payment networks have dates in the mid-2020s when they will be allowing issuers to remove the magnetic stripe from the cards and merchants to stop using the magnetic stripe as a POS entry mode. Tapped. This is called a contactless transaction. The card is hovered over the terminal's contactless reader symbol until the terminal gives a single beep. Though some sloppy card issuers and charlatans tried to give tap a bad reputation in its early days, it is much more secure than swiped transactions. Dipped. This is a contact EMV chip transaction. The card is inserted into the terminal to securely interact with the terminal. In many cases, the card holder is also prompted to enter their personal identification number, their PIN, to complete this transaction. There are many best practices for POS card entry modes. I will capture several of them in another video covering the good, the bad, and the ugly on this topic. Now the card information is in the terminal. The terminal takes the card information and adds additional information about itself and the transaction. Then it creates a transaction request message that it forwards to the acquirer. The acquirer receives the request message. They add additional information about the merchant, as well as tracking information they will use to uniquely identify the transaction. The acquirer then submits the request message to the payments network. At this point, this message is called an authorization request, or a transaction request, or an acquirer financial request. It is a data message requesting approval of a financial transaction. The payments network receives the request message. It then audits the inbound message to make sure it's valid, completes a risk assessment of the request, assigns tracking information to uniquely identify the transaction, adds additional routing information, and routes the request to the card issuer. The issuer receives the request from the payments network. The issuer will analyze the request for fraud, assess the risk profile of the request, verify the card information is valid, verify the card is connected to an account in good standing, and verify the account has sufficient funds to cover the request. If the issuer declines the request message is just a data exchange and will be documented as such. There is no financial transaction. If the issuer approves the request, this is where the financial transaction starts. Whether the request is declined or approved, the issuer creates a request response message. This message contains select data from the original request, data unique to the response message, if declined, a negative response value, if approved, a positive response value, and a unique issuer approval code. The issuer submits the response message to the payment network. The payments network routes the response to the acquirer. The acquirer routes the response to the merchant terminal. The merchant terminal shows a declined or approved message on the screen. Wow, that is a lot of activity for those less than 15 seconds we waited at the POS terminal. Hi, I'm Mark from mentoredbymarkt.com. Transaction processing is a very mature industry. New technologies in POS environments have introduced many complexities into it. In this video, we cover a POS face-to-face, card-present transaction. But what about non-face-to-face, e-commerce, recurring payments, ATM transactions, cards on phones, tokenization? How do these transactions work? Through Mentored by Mark T, I come alongside your card payments team to coach them on how things work in this increasingly complex environment. Feel free to contact me to open the conversation. I can make your teams and staff more knowledgeable and more productive in their payment industry roles. My contact information is at the end of this video. Now, let's get back to our transaction. As I mentioned before, a declined transaction request is just a data message and is documented as such by the merchant, acquirer, payments network, and issuer. An approved request message begins a financial transaction. For the issuer, it is a promise to pay for the transaction. The issuer will either put a hold on the cardholder's account for the amount of the approved request, or they may remove those funds from the cardholder's account immediately. For the payment network, this is now a transaction that qualifies for the settlement process, a process that will move funds from the issuer to the acquirer. For the acquirer, this is now a transaction and is logged as such so that it can be reconciled in the settlement process. For the merchant, this is a guarantee of funds for the purchase amount. Therefore, the merchant allows me to leave the store with the merchandise being mine. At this point, the data portion of the transaction is pretty much complete. Parts of the data will be replicated in the following 3 stages that complete the financial transaction, but almost no new data will be created. For the financial transaction, we still must complete 3 of its 4 steps. The first step that we've already described is called authorization. Authorization takes place in real time, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The next 2 steps, reporting and settlement, are scheduled events. The final step, reconciliation, can only take place after reporting and settlement have completed. Reporting can be called reports or clearing. These 2 terms are slightly different and related to single message or dual message transactions. I will cover these differences in a separate video. For this video, we will just call this step reporting. Reports are generated listing all the approved authorizations in the processing cycle. Processing cycle is simply an arbitrary time frame that allows transactions to be grouped together for reporting, settlement, and reconciliation. The cadence of this cycle can vary. For debit account cardholders, the processing cycle is real time. The funds are removed from their account as soon as the transaction request is approved. For issuers, payment networks, acquirers, merchants, the processing cycle is typically daily. A net settlement position is created for each processing day. For credit card holders, the processing cycle is monthly. They receive their credit card statement each month. This uncovers one additional secret about the reporting process. The reporting begins centralized. Typically, one of the participants in the transaction creates the original transaction report. The reports are then consolidated and distributed to different participants. This triggers different reports, each of which may have a different reporting and settlement cadence. It can look like our single transaction is fragmenting into many transactions. Really, it is the same one transaction, just routing through processes that run at different cadences. Once the reports have been created and distributed, each party will know its net settlement position. If only one transaction were completed in a reporting cycle, the settlement would be very simple. However, typically there are millions of transactions in each reporting and settlement cycle. Instead of settling each transaction individually, the reports steps creates a net settlement position from the detailed transaction records. This net position is handed off to the settlement step. In the settlement step, we have net debit parties, typically the issuers and the cardholders, and net credit parties, typically the acquirers and the merchants. The payments network will facilitate the settlement between the issuers and acquirers on their network. The issuers are responsible for collecting the required funds from their cardholders, and the acquirers are responsible for providing the required funds to the merchants. Because settlement occurs with this high-level net settlement position, a reconciliation step is required after settlement completes. Reconciliation matches the detailed transaction level reporting to the net settlement position. This is done to make sure that all transactions are accounted for. In my almost 30 years in the payments industry, I have seen the authorization, reporting, and settlement steps become more automated and electronically driven. This has made reconciliation process a more mundane task than it was 30 years ago. However, it is still critically important, as any auditor will tell you. Once reconciled, the financial portion of the transaction is now complete. The data portion of the transaction is typically assigned to a database somewhere for future reference if needed. There are several topics I touched on in this video. As I've already mentioned, I will be doing more in-depth videos on these topics in the near future. If you found this video helpful, please click on the like button and subscribe to this channel. If you have more questions about the payments industry, leave a message in the comments below. You can also contact me through my website, mentoredbymarkt.com, or via email, markt@mentoredbymarkt.com.